President Trump again called on Fed Chair Jerome Powell to cut interest rates after threatening to oust the Federal Reserve Chairman last week. For more on the latest tensions between the White House and Chair Powell and how this could play out, let's welcome in Jeffrey Lacker, former Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond president and GMU Mercatus Center senior affiliated scholar. Jeffrey, thank you once again for joining us. We wanted to get some insight from someone who was at the Fed about what is going on right now. Obviously, Jay Powell has been very firm that he is not stepping down. He is not leaving. But what do you imagine the sort of vibe to be like in the Fed while all this is going on?
So on the one hand, this can be water off their back. They could ignore this quite easily, put their head down, get on with the analysis of what monetary policy needs to do in the coming months and years. I think they're on hold. I think they would have been on hold whether Trump criticized them in public or not. On the other hand, it's not helpful. It calls into question with some who might not be so closely familiar with the operations of the Fed. There are other market participants who might come to believe that the Fed would bend, would yield to Trump's pressure. So they're certainly viewing it as unhelpful.
Jeffrey, when you read those post by Trump, I mean, obviously he got very personal and goes after Powell, and Powell is late and he's a loser. He also did talk about preemptive cuts, right? I'm just curious what you made of that.
So I think it would be bad policy right now, but it's again not helpful. It's likely to erode the value of the dollar. It's likely to push bond yields higher. And I think that's why some of his closest advisors will understand the connection between the Fed's credibility and the outcomes that the president and the administration undoubtedly want, which is more robust economic growth in the United States. Understand that something that erodes the Fed's credibility, that leads people to think higher inflation is on the way or more likely, is not going to be helpful to their cause.
Jeff, just one line of thinking I'm curious to get your take on it is you might hear folks say, well, the recent inflation readings we got were benign, and to the extent that we see any, tariff-induced higher prices, they'll be transitory, temporary, not persistent. And really the big worry now is growth. So yes, the Fed should be getting ahead of this. They should be cutting. You say what to that, Jeff?
So first of all, it's early on. It's early inning. This is like the first or second inning. The data we have, we don't have any data after the April 2nd and then April 9th tariff announcements. And that data in terms of prices isn't going to really roll in until later in the summer because you've got a lot of stockpiling that's gone on. The prices really aren't going to hit for a couple of months. And then there's going to be a willingness by some firms to absorb it in the short run, but not in the longer run. So this is going to play out over the course of a year or more before we see the real inflationary effects.
What are the risks of a non-independent Fed, of a Fed that would be influenced more by the White House?
So one doesn't have to speculate. We've had two instances of that in history that were glaring and turned out very badly. The late 1960s, Lyndon Baines Johnson put tremendous pressure on the Fed chair at the time, William McChesney Martin. He had him out to the Texas ranch, drove him at high speed around the rutted ranch roads in a Cadillac convertible. There's a great picture of this online. And was just excoriated him. I mean, he was verbally abusive. It was terrible, and it caused the Fed. It caused the Fed to temper its fight against inflation as the Great Society programs and the buildup in the war in Vietnam added demand pressure that raised the inflation rate over the course of the late 60s. We ended up having inflation go from 1.5 to 5 in the course of a couple of years. After that, Arthur Burns took over as Fed chair under President Richard Nixon, and Nixon very explicitly pressured him to ease monetary policy going into the 1972 election in order to aid the re-election of the president. Wage and price controls helped keep inflation down over that interlude, but when the inflation controls were lifted in late 1973, inflation shot up from 2 or 3% to over 13%. And we were off to the races with go stop monetary policy and it took a decade or more for the Fed to wrest control of inflation, wrestle inflation to the ground and get it down to a moderate level. So we've had two very bad episodes with pressure that ended bad for the American people.
Jeff, I'm curious, just got a broader question. What you make of Trump's tariff strategy? You know, the goal, Jeff, the tactics. How do you think through it as an economist?
So one can picture an argument. I don't support this, but an argument for reshoring and building up manufacturing here in the United States. If one wanted to pursue that, though, this isn't quite the way one would implement a tariff program to that end. First of all, you'd want to accept the material inputs that go into manufacturing, the manufacturing activity you'd like to attract, and that would include a lot of manufactured goods abroad. One would also want to make the tariffs look permanent. So you'd want legislation for that. You'd want to phase them in because you'd want investment decisions to take into account the tariffs, but you'd want the short-term pain to be minimized, and you would do that by phasing them in. So it doesn't look like it's well calibrated to achieve that sort of end.
Jeff, great to have you on the show today. Thanks so much for your time today. Appreciate it.
Sure, my pleasure.